On the morning of May 27, 1940, German soldiers crouched behind burnt-out trucks, shattered stone walls, and hastily dug scrapes outside the French port of Dunkirk. Through field glasses fogged by sea air and cordite smoke, they stared at a scene that made no sense. 300,000 British and French soldiers were trapped. The Wehrmacht had done everything right. The panzer divisions had punched through the Ardennes, sliced the Allied front in half, and driven north with terrifying speed. Artillery thundered day and night. Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead, dropping bombs into the sand and water. The beaches were exposed. The sea was cold. The British Expeditionary Force was supposed to be finished. Every German soldier knew it. And yet, the enemy did not behave like a defeated army. Instead of chaos, the Germans saw order. Long lines of British soldiers stood waist-deep in freezing water, waiting calmly for hours. They did not scatter when bombs fell. They did not break under air attack. When a Stuka screamed down in a strafing run, the men ducked, waited, then stood back up and resumed their places as if nothing had happened. Small boats ferried them steadily to larger ships offshore. The process was slow, methodical, disciplined. One German officer wrote in his diary that night that he had never witnessed anything like it. He described the scene as deeply unsettling. The British were being destroyed, yet they behaved as though they were boarding trains for a holiday. What German soldiers witnessed at Dunkirk was not just an evacuation. It was the beginning of a puzzle that would trouble the Wehrmacht for the next 5 years. The British soldier was not supposed to be like this. German propaganda had painted Britain as decadent, soft, weakened by comfort and class division. A nation of shopkeepers who would fold once struck hard. The reality on the beaches of Dunkirk shattered that illusion. This is the story of what German soldiers really thought about the British during World War II. Not what they said in speeches. Not what propaganda claimed. But what they wrote privately in letters, recorded in diaries, and spoke about in conversations they never knew were being secretly monitored. The German military's first serious encounter with British ground forces came during the Battle of France in May 1940. The Blitzkrieg had crushed Poland in weeks and now tore through Western Europe with terrifying speed. Belgian resistance collapsed. French defenses cracked open. Even German commanders were stunned by how fast their advance unfolded. Army Group A surged through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse, and raced to the English Channel. The Allied armies in the north were cut off. Strategically, it was a masterpiece. Militarily, it should have ended the war in the west. More than 330,000 Allied troops were trapped around Dunkirk. German generals expected mass surrender. Instead, they encountered stubborn, calculated resistance. British rearguard units fought delaying actions that bought precious time. At places like Boulogne and Calais, battalions held out against overwhelming odds, knowing full well they were being sacrificed to save the main force. At Calais, Brigadier Claude Nicholson commanded roughly 4,000 men. Churchill's order was blunt: evacuation will not be repeated. Hold the port. Nicholson obeyed. For 4 days, his garrison tied down the German 10th Panzer Division. When Calais finally fell on May 26, the garrison was shattered. Only a handful escaped. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. German soldiers wrote home about the fighting with unexpected respect. They described house-to-house combat, room-by-room resistance, defenders who refused to surrender even when surrounded. One German sergeant noted that clearing the old town took 3 times longer than planned because British troops kept fighting from cellars and stairwells long after any rational hope of relief had vanished. The cost mattered. Every hour Calais held was another hour the evacuation at Dunkirk continued. At Arras on May 21, British tanks launched a counterattack that shocked the Germans. The force was small, just 74 tanks, but it struck the advancing columns hard enough to cause panic. German commanders believed for several hours that a major Allied offensive was underway. Erwin Rommel himself commanded the 7th Panzer Division during the attack. He later wrote that it was the most critical moment of the entire French campaign. His division took heavy losses before the British attack was contained. The psychological effect was profound. The British were encircled, outnumbered, and losing, yet they were still attacking. This behavior fed into the caution that led to Hitler's infamous Halt order, freezing the panzer divisions just short of Dunkirk. Whether motivated by terrain concerns, Luftwaffe overconfidence, or respect for British resistance, the Halt order gave the evacuation time to succeed. Between May 26 and June 4, more than 338,000 Allied troops escaped. Nearly 700 civilian vessels joined the rescue. German commanders watched in disbelief as their victory slipped across the Channel. They had won the battle. They had driven the British from the continent. But it did not feel like total victory. One German war correspondent wrote that watching the last ships leave was like seeing a wounded animal escape into the forest. You knew it was hurt badly. You also knew it would come back. He was right. The psychological impact of Dunkirk on German soldiers was enormous. They had expected Britain to seek peace once France fell. Instead, Churchill's speeches crackled over the radio, defiant and uncompromising. Britain was not surrendering. Britain was preparing to fight on alone. German soldiers struggled to understand this. Letters home from the summer of 1940 reveal genuine confusion. One NCO wrote that the English were either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. They had lost their equipment, abandoned the continent, and yet acted as if they had won something. This misunderstanding haunted German strategy. Hitler's peace overtures were rejected. The Battle of Britain was lost. Operation Sea Lion was postponed and quietly abandoned. Britain refused to behave like a defeated nation. German soldiers began to revise their opinions. The next great test of German respect for British troops came in North Africa. Beginning in 1941, the Desert War produced some of the most candid German assessments of their enemy. Rommel left detailed opinions in letters and reports. He admired British courage and discipline while criticizing their rigidity. He described Guards brigades as embodying the strengths and weaknesses of the British soldier, tremendous bravery paired with inflexible thinking. The original Desert Rats of the 7th Armored Division earned particular respect. Rommel noted that they were experienced, dangerous, and deeply familiar with desert warfare. They had been fighting since 1940 and knew how to survive. But Rommel's sharpest criticism was reserved for British commanders. He famously believed British troops were lions led by donkeys. The men were brave and capable. The generals were cautious, slow, and constrained by doctrine. This view was shared by many German officers. They admired British soldiers but felt British leadership wasted their courage through hesitation. The Siege of Tobruk became a symbol of British stubbornness. For 241 days, British, Australian, Indian, and Polish troops held the port against repeated German and Italian assaults. German propaganda mocked them as rats. The defenders adopted the name proudly. German soldiers wrote privately about Tobruk with grudging admiration. Attacking it felt like attacking a wall of bayonets. Every assault cost more than it gained. The defenders should have surrendered by any rational standard. They did not. The Desert War fostered a strange mutual respect. Prisoners were generally treated well. Rommel insisted on humane treatment and expected the same in return. Both sides endured the same brutal conditions: heat, thirst, disease, and endless sand. German soldiers wrote about watching British positions and seeing men just like themselves. Men who wanted to survive. Men who wanted to go home. One German officer wrote that reading a British soldier's letter to his wife, found in an abandoned position, made him realize how similar they were. Enemies by uniform, not by nature. This perception deepened through British Special Forces operations. Commando raids enraged Hitler. Small teams striking occupied Europe exposed the weakness of German coastal defenses. The Atlantic Wall was built in response. So was the Commando Order, demanding the execution of captured raiders. The order itself revealed German fear. Normal deterrence had failed. The commandos kept coming. In North Africa, the SAS destroyed hundreds of aircraft, hit supply lines, and vanished into the desert. German commanders devoted disproportionate resources to hunting them. They rarely succeeded. German diaries described these raiders as ghosts. Invisible until the damage appeared. The respect was not romantic. It was professional. German soldiers recognized skill when they saw it. The turning point came at El Alamein. Here, British caution turned into overwhelming force. Artillery fired in quantities the Germans could not match. The battlefield was crushed methodically. German courage no longer mattered. Material superiority decided the outcome. German veterans later said El Alamein showed how Britain preferred to fight when fully prepared. Slowly. Carefully. Relentlessly. The most honest German opinions came from conversations never meant to be heard. At Trent Park near London, captured German generals lived in comfort, unaware that every word they spoke was recorded. They talked freely. They criticized. They praised. They described British soldiers as professional, disciplined, stubborn in defense. They admired British artillery. They noted British reluctance to attack without overwhelming superiority. They were surprised by British resilience and refusal to make peace. These were not public statements. They were private truths. D-Day provided the final assessment. German soldiers facing the British in Normandy encountered an army transformed by experience. This was not Dunkirk. This was a machine refined by 4 years of war. The landings overwhelmed German defenses through sheer firepower and planning. British troops advanced methodically, absorbed casualties, and kept moving. German veterans described fighting against an industrial force, precise and unstoppable. They criticized British caution, but they respected British professionalism. After the war, German veterans were asked again and again about their enemies. Their answers were consistent. British soldiers were tough, disciplined, reliable. They fought cleanly. They treated prisoners correctly. They did not panic. The criticisms remained too. British leadership was cautious, predictable, risk-averse. They won through resources more than brilliance. These views contain bias, but the consistency suggests genuine belief. German soldiers preferred surrendering to British forces because they trusted them. That trust was earned. The German view of the British soldier was never simple hatred. It was respect mixed with frustration. Admiration mixed with criticism. It was the respect soldiers develop for enemies they have fought, suffered against, and survived. On the beaches of Dunkirk, in the deserts of North Africa, and in the hedgerows of Normandy, German soldiers learned the truth. The British were not soft. They were not weak. They could be beaten, but they would not stay beaten. That lesson stayed with them long after the war ended.